When they walked into the bedroom, he was in the wardrobe with, was it an axe and a knife?
And a knife, yeah.
So he'd got 2 weapons on him, and he jumped out and he said to the police, "I just wanted to surprise her." Just a quick disclaimer, the content presented in this podcast is based on real events and may contain graphic descriptions of violence, crime scenes and other disturbing material. Listener discretion is advised. This episode is sponsored by Think Forensic.
Think Forensic are a one-stop shop for all things forensic science and crime solving. They hold experience days, as well as corporate events, team building events, and general education for primary school right the way up to university level, as well as other events and consultancy. There's also a shop where you can get your hands on all things crime solving, from evidence gathering to packaging and collecting evidence, as well as other forensic science equipment.
For more information or to book on an experience day, please visit the website. Hi everyone and welcome back to episode 30 of the Grave Secrets podcast. We're your hosts, I'm Annie.
And I'm Beth. I feel like for 30 it should definitely get a doo-doo. At one stage I was doing that every time.
You know, when I was doing the notes for this, I was like, oh my God, it's 30. But then it didn't register until I've just said it now. And I was like, oh my God, we've done 30.
30 whole episodes.
Yeah, so that's 30 weeks we've been doing this.
Gosh.
It's crazy, isn't it?
It's quite a lot, isn't it, really? Considering.
Yeah, it's over 6 months, isn't it? April, May,
Yeah.
June, July, August, September, October. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks that people are still listening.
Thanks, we've still got people here. And
Thanks for
if
that.
you are watching, then just look how bright I am today.
Yes.
Like, you will never have seen me in these colours before. And I think, or ever again, no, I'm joking. And I feel like we're a bit sort of coordinated, sort of not. Like, we're all in fluorescent today. So I'm in fluorescent pink, Beth's in fluorescent green.
Yeah, I do love a green and pink combo. Generally, that's my go-to.
I'm not brave enough for that. I'm
but
certainly
look how
not.
well they go.
You know what? They do look nice, but it's just not me.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, you'd be wearing it and you'd look down and you'd think, oh.
I put this tracksuit on today, all in pink for this episode, like the joggers and everything, and then I thought, oh no, this is too much for camera, because I knew Beth was going to be bright as well, and I thought, well, we're going to be like overpowering on camera.
But we balanced it.
Best not. Yeah, anyway, back to the case. Sorry for the detour.
So, yes, today we have another case study for you. It's one that actually crosses borders. So we have recently, I feel like we've done quite a broad spectrum.
Yeah.
We've done a couple of US-based cases. Obviously, the death penalty one focused more on the US.
Yeah.
We've then done Wales. We've done a Welsh case in last week's episode. But then recently we did one based in Birmingham.
And we've done local in Bradford and Wakefield.
So
M25 rapists we did. Yeah. That covered quite a lot of areas as well.
So we've done quite a broad spectrum.
We're
and
working
this
our way
one,
through.
nicely, is when two become one.
A bit of Spice Girls throwback there. I used to love that song.
Yeah. And that was one of those where you'd imagine yourself sat on a high chair singing it.
With the microphone and everything.
Yeah, absolutely. So this case actually led to a joint European murder inquiry, and it was the first one between the two countries that we're going to talk about in more detail. So it became quite a high profile case.
It did, but I'd not actually heard of this one. I know we do say that sometimes. I didn't have much info on this one until I started researching, and to say it is quite
horrific.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they all are, but this is particularly horrific, I think.
Interestingly, I had more knowledge about this case than I did the crossbow cannibal case, which was more local.
And I was the opposite.
Yeah. But I remember you saying you knew more about that one.
Yeah.
So it is just funny what you consume, isn't it?
Yeah, what you come across.
But speaking of the crossbow cannibal case, which we covered in episode 28, and that was based around like the Bradford area, this case is somewhat similar, and we'll go on to explain why. But it did make me think, gosh, this happens more often. I say more often, like even it happening once is bad enough.
Yeah, like more than you think. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So it involves everything, trigger warning. I don't think we do those as much as we probably should.
I put one in every...
We put the disclaimer in at the beginning. But sometimes I think like...
We need an extra trigger.
Yeah. So this case does cover dismemberment, axe attacks, interestingly, artwork.
And domestic violence.
So there's an awful lot to talk through in this case. So we're just going to get stuck in.
Let's go in. We're 5 minutes in and we're like, we're just going to go straight into the case. Well, obviously not. We've just chatted for 5 minutes.
Yeah. Okay, so back in 1989, in November, early November, I think it was the 2nd.
Year I was born.
Oh.
I'm old, aren't I?
Well. Well, there was a woman named Melissa Halstead, aged 32, and she rang her mum to wish her happy birthday. And the reason that she was ringing her rather than seeing her is because Melissa was living in Amsterdam and she was calling her mum, who was back in Ohio.
Yeah, so was she actually from Ohio then, and she'd been living in Amsterdam?
And then she'd moved around. And just 6 months later, Melissa would be found dead. Right. So we're going to start with that, and then it's all going to unravel from there. So it was actually on May the 3rd, 1990, 6 months after that phone call to her mother, that a headless female torso was discovered in the canal. And it was in a canal in Rotterdam. And if I try and pronounce it, I believe...
I didn't even write it down because I knew I wouldn't even be able to pronounce this.
Okay. I'm going to say it was called...
Go on.
Westersingle?
I'm sure that's wrong.
Yeah, well, I don't think it sounds right either. Because the word did remind me of something, but I've already forgotten what it was.
Yeah. No, I couldn't pronounce... I know when the... When they said it in the documentary, I was like, oh. Anyway,
large canal in Rotterdam.
Yeah, I think is it the one that runs right through the middle?
Yes, It's one of the main ones, isn't it? So a torso was discovered, but it was in like a big, darkly coloured, like army rucksack. When you think of a rucksack, to me, you think of ones with a zipper on that have got the like 2 shoulder straps.
Yeah.
This was one of the more like old school sack bags that they had in the army.
Right, okay.
Where it's almost like a circular base.
Yeah.
And then just material that then comes to a drawstring at the top.
Right.
And then sometimes they do have like a lid over the top that you can put on for protection. But it was one of those type of bags rather than what we would think of as a rucksack.
See, already it's similar to crossbow cannibal, isn't it? But when I was doing the research, I didn't really relate them as closely as whereas we started off exactly the same, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the torso was obviously taken from the bag, and when they were inspecting it, they found that it had had the hands removed. So obviously there is no head, it's just a torso, and there's also no hands.
Yeah, it's almost as if when you find something like this, it's almost as if those body parts have been removed for a certain reason. So you can get identification from, obviously, the fingerprints and from the head.
Yeah.
You would be able to identify the person. So when it comes down to something which is just a torso, it is intentionally being removed for that reason, to prevent identification.
Yeah, so you can't then do forensic odontology, which would be analysis of teeth, because again, teeth are a really great way of finding DNA, age of person, that kind of thing. Fingerprints inevitably would give us a potential match to a person.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you've got the fact that the body's been found in water. And so even if they could get DNA from the torso, it'd be made much more difficult by the fact that there's then been the disruption to the DNA and contamination of the water. So really tricky.
Yeah.
Ultimately, they would look for missing persons reports, and they didn't find anyone that could be a potential match for the torso.
You'd sort of try and match them up, wouldn't you, and see if it... Because, I mean, you can tell certain things. They would be able to tell, obviously, if they were what ethnicity or if they were white. And in this case, they said that it was a white female, late 20s to early 30s. And you can tell this if they've got, you can have a look at the pelvis, if they've got the bones, could tell if it's male or female. Late 20s, early 30s, you can also age people from the pubic bone as well. So if they did have that, but I don't know how far the decomposition had gone on the body to get to those bones. So I'm not 100% sure what they used for the identification in this case.
And obviously, if you're lucky enough, you might have antecedent markers.
Yeah.
So it sounds like the arms were intact. I've got tattoos on my arms, I've got tattoos on my chest, on my side. So even if it was my torso, there would still be these antecedent markers.
But if someone wanted to identify, if someone wanted to stop you being identified, you would get rid of them because we would know you from your tattoos straight away.
Yeah. So I think it's one of those where it's clearly a well thought out deposition of partial body. But they've obviously made it more difficult for DNA. And at that stage, DNA technology was just not advanced enough anyway, really, to get anything useful in terms of identification.
Yeah, because in the 90s, we spoke about it quite a bit, haven't we? Like, how much it's changed over the years is absolutely insane.
And they did absolutely do like all that they could in terms of using DNA and acknowledging that DNA was crucial and could be pivotal in terms of evidence.
Yeah.
But it's just if you've not got physically the capacity to do the testing that you're probably aware of would be useful.
Yeah.
But just physically can't
do anything with it. Yeah. So I feel like they did know that it would come in useful at some point because in a lot of the cases we talk about from maybe the 80s and the 90s, the officers or the CSIs at the scene of the crime do take the DNA samples.
Yeah.
So the samples are there, it's just nothing can be done with them until later on.
Yeah, I was just about to say, like, yes, they might not be able to process it, but the way that they packaged it and preserved that DNA evidence was incredible because that's how so many cases now are getting
and
solved.
Especially in this case when, you know, later down the line cold case team come to review stuff, you need to have it all correct at the time, don't you?
And in this case that's exactly what happened. So the Dutch set up their first missing persons DNA bank. So any missing person that they had reported, or obviously in this case, a body of that doesn't match a missing person, went into a database in 2007.
Right.
And so the remains from the body in the Rotterdam Canal were then added to that. And they then came up as a match of Melissa Halstead's remains, basically. Came up for a match for her disappearance. There is a reason that it took so long for that disappearance to be equated with the torso, but I'll talk about that in a bit.
So the DNA, the missing persons DNA system is quite a good way of doing things, isn't it?
Yeah,
but I
definitely.
think if a family member reports you missing, why wouldn't they take a swab of the family's their database, their DNA, to put it in a database, not in the criminal database, in a separate one?
Yeah.
And then when you do have someone like this who can't be identified, and you can get a bit of their DNA,
would come up as a match.
It would pop up as a match on the system. Whereas Melissa wouldn't have been on the system in the first place because she wasn't a criminal.
Yeah.
So you'd have to have something to match it to. So if a relative is willing, when they come forward to report a missing person, that would be a good thing to have in place.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
because I would do if it was my sister.
Yeah,
if my sister had gone missing, I'd say take my DNA.
Because it's familial matches that they find, familial DNA. Would it have to be like a mother, a sister? It could be brother, couldn't it?
Because you're following the female line,
maternal
aren't you?
line,
Maternal line, yeah.
So it'd have to be certain family members, but it's definitely doable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just think it'd be a...
Yeah, makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Okay.
I've only just thought of that on the spot now.
Get them on it. Once this link was made, they could then find more information about Melissa. And Melissa, as I mentioned, was American. She was actually a model, and the photos of Melissa are absolutely incredible.
She's so beautiful,
like,
isn't she?
She was gorgeous, yeah. And one of those where you can tell that even just off the cuff, when someone catches you,
she's going to get that good shot.
Looked incredible.
Yeah.
She was the daughter of an Illinois dentist, and she was working to make money so that she could model and travel as a freelance photographer and beautician.
Oh, okay.
But she didn't think that being in Ohio was going to kind of progress her career like she wanted it to. So she decided to move to the UK.
Okay.
So Melissa had decided to move to the UK, but then you think, but hang on, her body's been found in Rotterdam.
Yep.
So how do we get there? So eventually Melissa's visa had run out for the UK, which is why she then decided to travel Europe. So again, I mentioned that phone call that she'd had to her mum. Her mum was quite used to not hearing from her for periods of time.
Yeah.
They'd check in, but they were quite aware that she'd got her own life and
so
that she was travelling.
Was 6 months, like, 'cause to me, 6 months is quite a long time. I'd expect to hear from someone, you know, like even if it was just a random check-in, at least.
It was only a month between her being found and that last call.
Yeah.
So there wasn't too much time. And they did keep in regular contact. So I know that while Melissa was living in the UK, her sister actually came over.
She came to visit, didn't she? Yeah.
So she is travelling around Europe, and then she ends up settling in the Netherlands. And she had a landlord in Amsterdam who actually said that he'd gone on holiday in April of 1990, and she was living in his basement flat. And that when he returned and went to see why she'd not paid her rent, she'd just vanished.
Right.
So he was then aware that she was missing as well. And again, her family had reported her missing. And they had reason to be concerned as well.
The sister especially.
Yes, because she was believed to be in an abusive relationship. She had said that was fueled by drink and drugs, and quite often we do find that, unfortunately, victims will kind of make excuses for their partner because they'll say, well, if he's not had a drink, he's not like that, and things. But Melissa had said to her sister, if anything happens to me, it will be him that's done something.
When her sister went to the UK to visit her, she was with her partner then, and her sister said she got a really bad vibe. She didn't like him at all.
No.
So she knew something was sort of off, but Melissa's been out there, you know, travelling, doing a thing. She can look after herself. Yeah. It's sort of like, I think she voiced her opinions, but didn't think,
no,
you know,
there's not a lot you can do.
Thought, well, I'll tell her what I think, but, you know, what more can I do in this situation?
Yeah. So the reason that the torso was not actually linked to Melissa initially is actually because her family had reported her missing in Amsterdam. So they'd rung up and told Amsterdam authorities that they wanted to report her missing, but she was actually found, so the torso was actually found in Rotterdam, and these are two separate districts that weren't linked.
At that time as well, I think now they can, with the technology, they can cross over into different districts and different areas.
Yeah, so now in the UK we've got something called the Home System, which I've
links
probably
everything
mentioned before. That pulls all of the relevant information through. So if you're looking for a specific car and it's been reported missing in a different district, it'll come up.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't have had that at the time.
Didn't have it back in the day.
So that is why, unfortunately, it took so long before the connection was made. So we will pause that one a second.
Okay.
So Melissa has now been identified as being the headless torso found in Rotterdam Canal. However, this case was still unsolved. So they were still trying to work out how she'd been murdered.
Yeah, I think they worked out that maybe she'd been tied up with rope.
Yes.
But other than that, there wasn't a great deal of evidence that could lead to who had done this.
And unfortunately, in somewhere like Rotterdam and Amsterdam, there are going to be so many people in their late 20s, early 30s travelling and working out there. So it would be really difficult to, find those connections. So that case is still ongoing, still unsolved at this stage. But years later, a similar case occurs, this time in the UK. So Paula Fields vanishes into thin air, and 3 months later, basically another bag was found, actually by children, which I thought was awful. It made me feel so awful for them, because they were fishing down at the Regent's Canal near King's Cross in London. This was on the 19th of February 2001. And they saw this bag, didn't know what it was, don't know whether they opened it. You'd like to think that it smelled.
You would though, wouldn't you?
So
because if you were a kid as well and you found this bag, you'd think, oh my God, what's it like? I need to have a look.
So they then called the police, and then as the police obviously got the underwater search team out and dredged the lake, they actually found 5 other bags of body parts. So there were over 10 body parts in total,
bags,
in different bags that were found. But again, in this case, what made it so similar to the case in Rotterdam was that there were no head, hands, and in this case, feet. So, I mean, the amount of cases that happen in the UK, in, any country, when we don't even have a knowledge of it, there's no way that they would instantly go,
oh, yeah, especially when it's not even... I get it when it's local, if it's something like that and it's even within the UK, if there's been a certain amount of bodies found and they're all killed in the same way, you would think about it. So in this case, when the body was identified as Paula, the police had a look into Paula's background, and unfortunately she was really vulnerable. So she had had a problem with drugs and sex work. She'd been buying drugs and saying, oh, my boyfriend will pay you. And then that had caused problems back at home. She'd had drug dealers that she owed money to coming round to the house, trying to sort of get the money for the drugs that she'd taken.
Because she was actually from Liverpool, but had moved to London. So again, away from a family. Like, she'd have made friends, but probably not the right kind of friends.
Her friends will probably have all been within the same circle. But she had actually been in a relationship with a guy that called himself Joe Scouse. So with him being called Joe Scouse, they had both come from the Liverpool area. And then she was in this relationship with him. But because of all the problems with the drugs, the sex work, and bringing all the trouble to the doorstep, it had turned quite violent quickly. And it was an abusive relationship that Paula was in on top of everything else, which is, it's really sad, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just horrific because, again, in a lot of cases that we talk about, people don't understand. So when you are in something like sex work, if you are in that kind of industry, it's not like you see on the telly where it's women that are just wanting to make, over 10 grand a month, that kind of thing. We're talking about really vulnerable people who have nothing in their lives, and the only way that they can make even £10 to then sustain themselves for a day or 2 days is to, unfortunately, sell their bodies. And so we're not talking about people that are doing this because they like the lifestyle. We're talking about really vulnerable people. And quite often that is then in line with being in a vulnerable relationship as well as just being a vulnerable person yourself. The investigation at that stage, it was DNA evidence. Thankfully, it had progressed.
Yeah, because by this time it's 2000, so we're on December 2000. So DNA was well on its way to.
So they've not got. They still didn't have head, hands, or feet, so really difficult. But thankfully, they still could identify. And what we were saying about connecting cases, that's also a tough one in itself, because if you are if we think about the Ipswich serial killer who preyed on victims and sex workers in that area, it's very difficult for officers to actually say for certain that those cases are linked until they have some forensic proof of it.
Yeah. You can have the same MO, can't you? Yeah. And we can say like, it looks like those are linked.
Yeah.
But without that physical evidence that's there.
Yeah. So it'd be very difficult in this case for them to say, well, that reminds us of a case that we heard about in the news over in Rotterdam.
Yeah.
Must be the same person. Because realistically, you've got no...
all them miles away.
Yeah, you've got no evidence to suggest that it is. So we've mentioned the boyfriend. He had a few different nicknames. He was a real tall Liverpudlian man, so he was quite distinctive. And eventually the police managed to trace his name to someone called John Patrick Sweeney. And he very quickly became a person of interest.
Yeah.
So generally you go person of interest, then suspect, and then you go offender that's about to be charged with.
And you also look as well, if you have a suspect, like how that suspect is linked to both cases in this one.
Yeah.
So that's one thing the police will be doing the background work now on Joe Scouse or John Sweeney to find out if there was a connection, to see if he had done both of these murders, if he'd done any or none or both.
And I don't think British police had any idea at this stage, did they? They were just working on the Paula Fields case.
Yeah, so they did not connected, had they, with the Dutch case?
No.
Yeah.
So they were just investigating John at this time, trying to get as much information about Paula, their victim, and they tried to track John down, found where he was working, and he was actually working on a construction site on Fleet Street. So he was about to start work. So bear in mind he's on his way to work, okay? He then is arrested, and they find that on his person he has not only a knife, but also a gun. He's on his way to work on a construction
Sounds like something
site.
in America, doesn't it?
That was my next point, because a gun... Remembering that we're in the UK,
is illegal, fully
illegal, and it doesn't thankfully happen where people are known for keeping a gun on their person.
Yeah, and you could say if it was just a knife, you could say what trade does he work in? Is it like a certain knife that's illegal, or is it one that's used on trade, or like? But to have a gun and a knife is extreme in the UK. Yeah.
So John was actually known to be a carpenter. He'd actually travelled quite a lot, and carpentry or woodwork seemed to be, especially joinery, I guess, would be quite a good niche almost for construction sites. Generally, there'll always be something that they'll need, and that was the case in at Fleet Street. But as soon as they started looking into John, they saw that he was violent and controlling and had quite a severe history of domestic abuse.
Yeah, there was, there's quite a lot of background to John. I mean, we're not going to cover absolutely loads of it, but just to sort of put it into perspective a bit. So he was born in Liverpool. His dad was violent to John. So we think, maybe that has an impact on how you treat others. He was actually very artistic, so he didn't originally want to be a carpenter. He wanted to go to art school, and he was always drawing. It was something that was like basically his passion. But I think back then it was a bit frowned upon to go to art school, and it was more sort of stable if you went and got a trade. So that's what he did, and worked as a carpenter. But even as a teenager, he did have convictions for violence and for using an axe as well, which is extreme for a teenager.
I know, absolutely. So he was born in 1956. So again, when we're talking about like getting a job in a trade and then you stick at that job for 20 odd years, that's it's like definitely the case. If you'd have said you wanted to be an artist at that stage, it's different to what it is now. Well, is it?
Yeah.
And I think that probably created a bit of resentment. Do you know what I mean? If you're that kind of, if you're artistic and that way inclined, for someone to say no, that's not as significant of a
as a job, or you
as
can't
a
make
talent.
money from it.
It's not valued as a talent, is it? And I think that must be quite difficult.
And with his dad obviously being abusive towards him, and then also his dad wanting him to get a job in the trade, it's like a bit of a double whammy here, isn't it? But even as a teenager, he's already on the police radar.
Yeah.
But he did marry very young. He married at 18, 18 years old. He settled down and he married Anne, and they went on to have 2 children. But again, that turned out to be a horrific, violent relationship.
Yeah, very abusive very quickly, and usually against his wife. I think it was clear that he was violent in general, but especially with his wife. But so John Sweeney, so I'll refer to him as Sweeney, he was also said to be violent towards animals. And again, we've talked about this in a lot of cases.
We've heard this before.
Yeah, we've talked about this in a lot of cases now. But in this case, the children actually had pet tortoises. It was either tortoises or
a
turtles.
turtle, something like that, wasn't it? Yeah.
And he'd actually abused the turtles, and unlike in the Crossbow Cannibal where there was explicit detail about the abuse of animals, it didn't actually go into any detail from what I could see.
No.
But that was apparent. And so she'd actually divorced Sweeney within 5 years. But in a lot of these domestic violent based cases, unfortunately, the victims are vulnerable, and she did end up taking Sweeney back.
She did, and I just think the stuff that he did to her was absolutely horrific. So Anne had actually had surgery, and she'd got a surgery scar, and he had been that violent and attacked her that it actually split open her surgery scar. Like, imagine recovering from something so awful anyway, and then having your scar split open. I feel like he was just so controlling, and at this point Anne wants to leave again. Like, you can't, it wasn't sustainable.
So they'd had the 5 years together. They then split up. Unfortunately, they got back together. It's at that stage that he has this horrific attack on his wife. Again, he's got her back, but then that's the classic case of, don't worry, I'm never going to do it again. I wouldn't hurt you.
It was apparently all right for a while, and then he slipped back into it, which is the routine of an abuser.
Yeah. Interestingly, though, and I think this is quite key in this case, John Sweeney, again, when they were questioning people that knew him from living in London, obviously people that knew him from Liverpool, they did say that he was quite a bohemian, quite happy-go-lucky, and so he did have this capacity to show multiple sides of himself, or hide multiple sides of himself, because he appeared quite easygoing, quite easy to talk to. We have quite a few instances in this case of him approaching women and making conversation with them.
Yeah, he wasn't shy or scared to talk to women like we do find in some of the cases.
Yeah.
It's because they resent women and they hate them and they can't talk to them and they don't get the attention they want, which is why they act like they do. But this didn't seem like the case with John, did it?
No, and again, he had travelled quite a lot himself, so he'd had a lot of different jobs and got on with people really well. So this adds another layer to the abusive relationships that he's in, because quite clearly he is good at tricking people into thinking that he is a good or nice person.
Yeah.
So then, of course, they are more susceptible to getting sucked back into that relationship.
Did you see what he did with Anne right at the end, though? So she, Anne had split up with him for what was the final time for her, and she was out in the garden and she heard a noise coming from her own house. She, I think, suspected at this point that it could be Sweeney.
Yeah.
And instead of approaching and going in the house herself, she actually rang the police, which was the best thing that she could have done.
Yeah.
So the police attended and they went into the house. They went to search the house for Sweeney, thinking he might be hiding in there somewhere. And when they walked into the bedroom, he was in the wardrobe with, was it an axe and a knife?
And a knife, yeah.
So he'd got two weapons on him, and he jumped out and he said to the police, I just wanted to surprise her. The thing is, though, this is early on when he got married at 18, so he's not much older. He's probably early 20s at this point. He is arrested, but then he's released without charge, and Anne had to move away to Northampton. Like, she was the one that had to move away after, I believe that if the police weren't there, he could have killed Anne as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was obviously his intention.
But these behaviours should have been picked up back then.
Yes.
Because for someone to jump out of a wardrobe with an axe and a knife, they should be in prison.
Yeah.
So if that would have been picked up all the way back then, we wouldn't
be in
all this wouldn't have happened.
And what case was it now where I said if they'd have served their whole sentence, that would have been
John Wayne Gacy.
Yeah. So it's a similar set of circumstances, isn't it?
Yeah.
Offences really early on
that
then aren't picked up or aren't dealt with in the severity that they should be, and then lead to more. On such a huge scale.
Yep.
So obviously Anne then moved to safety, but that then led Sweeney to start travelling because he was then aware that the police were breathing down his neck. They knew that he was a piece of work, so he then decided to travel. And when investigating him and kind of tracking where he'd moved around, it was actually then that they discovered a connection with how he met Melissa.
So Sweeney had actually met Melissa on a photo shoot. So Melissa was the model and Sweeney was working on the set.
Yeah, I imagine he was probably physically building something.
Yeah, in the background.
Set. Yeah.
So that's how they met, and they quite quickly became a couple. Everything started off all right, which again normally does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And then Melissa had actually agreed to move to London to live with John Sweeney, because that's where he wanted to be. I'm guessing that Melissa probably thought being a model she could move around and get the work.
Yeah, well, I was just about to say, and being in London always sounds like somewhere that you're going to find.
It does, doesn't it? It sounds like somewhere where everyone would be able to find work. But when they moved to London together, that's when the relationship took a turn and ended up being really abusive. And then while we're in London, they've mentioned that the sister came to visit.
Yeah.
She saw the sort of controlling behaviour of Sweeney, and Melissa's sister was like, it's just something.
She also said that she found drugs at the flat and that Melissa wasn't usually a drug taker. So it was things like that. It was just a bad influence on her.
Yeah.
But if you imagine now, you've got Melissa, who is originally from America.
She's isolated again.
Yeah, she's then moved from Amsterdam, where they'd met, and so she'd probably got a circle of friends and relationships there.
Yeah.
He's then isolated her even further by moving her to London.
Because in London, she wouldn't have had time to meet anyone either, so she wouldn't have had any friends around her really at that point.
And again, I think, when you look at photographs of her and everything, and you think, how would she fall for someone like him? Such a horrible piece of work. But this is where he did portray different sides of himself, and he would have been really charming. And then what he would have done is chip away at her confidence. Yeah. And especially at that time, even being a model, that chips away at your confidence anyway. I say that like I've been... that chips away at your confidence.
No,
but
it's the pressure, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the expectation and the pressure. And proving to everyone that you've left behind in America that you are going to find your way and that you are going to become a model. So I think it would have been a lot easier than people may have assumed in order for him to, knock down her confidence and leave her believing.
And it'd actually been violent to Melissa quite a few times, but she'd actually reported him to the police twice.
Yeah.
But I did think, with being a model, if he is beating her up and being physically abusive, that is then going to affect getting her work as a model, because if you've got a black eye, you can't go into work. If you are covered in bruises, or if you can't go into a modelling job like that. I do think
quite a lot of the work that she was actually doing, though, at that stage was this freelance, beautician work.
rather than the full modelling.
Yeah. But she had reported him, and in 1987 they'd actually attended one incident where John had actually thrown a chair at Melissa, and I think it had hurt her legs.
Yeah.
I don't know what had actually happened, but he'd thrown a chair on her, so the police had been called for that offence. And then again, on another occasion, he'd actually repeatedly punched her, so she would have had bruises and, a horrific, just someone repeatedly attacking you.
These are escalating, so even though she's not reporting every single one, they are getting worse and worse, but this should have also been picked up on.
Because for both of those offences, all he received was a fine.
Yeah,
he didn't get anything
crazy,
more than a fine for either of those. And again, it speaks to the kind of belief in standing up for yourself, because if that's happened twice now, Melissa probably wouldn't want to report it because the violence would get worse post offence, and she'd be worried that it wouldn't really change anything.
Well, it's not going to, is it? And
it didn't.
It didn't,
because
in this case,
in 1988 there was another attack, and this time it was in Austria, because they'd moved to Austria. I think basically what had happened is that things were obviously not going well in the UK, and the couple decided that they'd move again to somewhere new. They both enjoyed travelling and thought that might be a better start for them. Again, a fresh start.
Yeah, they travelled around quite a lot, didn't they?
Yeah, and I think it did. And supposedly, again, like when they first got to London, things were better. But then quite quickly, another attack occurs. And this time, Sweeney is actually jailed. But that is because this offence was absolutely horrific. He'd actually fractured Melissa's skull using a hammer. So he'd actually just repeatedly attacked her with a hammer, which is why the offence, thankfully, he was arrested. However, while in prison, rather than thinking, oh God, what have I done? This is the most serious repercussion that I've ever experienced, he just built up a real hatred for Melissa and blamed her for the fact that he was in prison. While he was in there, he actually did start creating some artwork.
Yeah, and we've already said he was very artistic anyway, so it's probably just an excuse to start it back up. But it is very significant in this case because the stuff that he was drawing was very dark, and it did actually, the art that he was drawing in prison did actually become pieces of evidence in the cases, didn't it, when the police looked into it.
So unfortunately, as we see with these cases, Melissa then obviously felt guilty. She probably didn't know how to live without Sweeney at this stage because she's been so indoctrinated. And she actually pleaded for clemency for Sweeney, which effectively means that they kind of wipe that offence.
I don't think we can do that in the UK. I think it's a different law that they have in Austria where the victim can get the offender ultimately released, can't they? Yeah,
because they do talk about clemency cases when we looked at the death row episode. You can ask for clemency, but I think it's there's certain stipulations,
like criteria, isn't there? Yeah.
So he was released, and then in 1989, so a year later, they move again. And that's when they then moved to Amsterdam. And ultimately, it would be in Amsterdam that Sweeney would then go on to murdering Melissa and then moving her body 50 miles and disposing of it. So she'd actually never lived in Rotterdam. It's not that she was living in Rotterdam at the time, but Sweeney decided to move her body over 50 miles and then dispose of it. And that in itself is just
and they think
disgusting.
That he did that by putting her in like bags and a rucksack, and then similar to Crossbow Cannibal again, they thought the only way that he could have done it is to get on a train and get on public transport. To transport Melissa's body 50 miles away.
I know,
just to dispose of her.
So we have now talked about the violence that's been escalating since the age of 18 when he was first married to his first wife. And obviously they are still researching Sweeney. At this stage, they discover a surviving victim. And the surviving victim was delia Delia Balmer. And Delia had actually met Sweeney in 1991.
She was a little bit older than the others, wasn't she?
She was a little bit older, and at this stage, Sweeney was 34. So effectively, they were both out individually in Camden. She was a nurse at the time, so I think she'd probably gone for a drink after work, and she'd seen Sweeney. And Sweeney had approached her and asked if he could buy her a drink. They'd been chatting, and he was talking about how he'd been travelling and that he'd lived in Germany and that kind of thing.
That'd be quite appealing back then, though, wouldn't it? You know, it wasn't travelling like nowadays where a lot of people just, you know, get up and go, don't they?
Yeah.
To find someone who's actually got the same interests of you to travel wherever must be quite rare.
Yeah. And not only did his personality change, but he did have quite a few different looks, didn't he? Like sometimes he had really long hair slicked back,
and the beard,
sometimes
and no
he looked
beard.
more like a carpenter.
Yeah,
it seems like he could
switch it up
really well. Yeah. So they kind of left it at that. They had a drink and that was that. And then a few days later, they actually just coincidentally bumped into each other again. And at that stage, he'd asked her for another drink and she'd felt guilty for saying no. So unfortunately, and she says this was the worst decision she ever made, but Delia felt that guilty for kind of turning him down. She wrote him a letter to apologise, and I don't know how she got the letter to him, but wrote him a letter, and quite quickly he then again would have charmed her, said don't worry about it, I just really liked you, and they then embarked upon a relationship.
It was very helpful as well. Like we said before, he seemed to sort of step in and try and take the place of the man in the house in terms of doing the DIY, repairing stuff, helping out around the house. And in this case, Delia wasn't very well off and she needed a lot of furniture. She couldn't afford to buy the furniture, and she said that he would help out and Sweeney would actually build and make her the furniture for her house to save her money.
He'd made her kitchen stools so that she had somewhere to sit in the kitchen to eat. A bed, she'd not got a proper bed, so he made a whole what's the word, bed frame a whole bed frame for her. But then that kind of kindness did switch, and quite subtly to begin with. But she said, for example, that because there are interviews with Delia that you can watch, but she said that what had happened was that he'd said she needed new kitchen cupboards. She, at this point, would have probably been feeling guilty that he was doing so much for her. And so she'd said, no, well, don't worry about it. They're fine as they are. But then she then found that he was intentionally damaging the kitchen cupboard so that he would then have to replace them.
Yeah, and she'd said, didn't you, why did you do that? And he'd not really, you know, he'd just done it. I feel like he wanted Delia to need him.
Yes.
To need him to do stuff constantly, because he wanted to feel like he was in control and of use, and that she couldn't be without him.
And that then matches because Delia said it got to a point where she couldn't go anywhere without him. So even to the shop or to the pub, she said they did everything together, and so she had no real life of her own. By May 1994, so they met in 91, and by 94, Sweeney had started physically attacking Delia, but to a horrific degree. And in May, he actually tied her to her own bed and threatened her again, both with a knife and a gun, stating that he'd actually killed Melissa, his ex-girlfriend, and cut up her body. He also mentioned two other people. He also said that he'd killed
He caught her with two German men, and he'd killed those as well. But all this, when he tied Delia up to the bed, it was all because she had gone out for the day with her friends.
Yes, and he was jealous.
She went out in the daytime with her friends for lunch.
couple of hours,
and ended up in this situation. So imagine how scary that will be for Delia now. She's tied up. He's admitted to murder.
Yeah.
Like, what? I just...
You don't know what's going to come next. And she said at that stage it was like he could read her mind because she didn't want to be there anymore and she was scared. But it was almost as if he knew that, and that's why he was keeping her in this state of fear.
He actually held her hostage at this point, didn't he?
So, yeah, and she was being held hostage for a week. And then after a week, again, like we see with these people that are unstable, he kind of just turned, let her free, and said that she could go back to work. But at this point, Delia had tried to leave him multiple times, and Sweeney had just refused to leave. Obviously, then after telling Delia about Melissa, Delia then said, I'm going to go to work and I don't want you to be here when I get back. But Sweeney would just refuse to leave. Thankfully, so that was in May, this terror continues, but by November, thankfully, he actually left the home. And as soon as he did, Delia changed the locks on the house.
See, at this point, you think you are on the road to safety now because you've changed the locks. You know he can't get in. He can't be in hiding anywhere like he was with his first wife.
Yeah.
But that wasn't even the case because he came back to the house, realised the locks were changed, and then that just sent him even more crazy.
Into another fit of rage.
Yeah.
So then on the 11th of November, he actually broke in, regardless of the locks being changed, and attacked her. And he actually shoved his hand down Delia's throat. And she, again, went to the police in this case. And unfortunately, I think she must have reported it. And then obviously they'd have to go out and try and track him down. But unfortunately, when she returned home, he was then again there and attacked her again. So she is now completely stuck, isn't she? And there was another account of her being attacked, and they did then decide to search her house because obviously she'd been living in it with him. And there was actually, it must have been quite a thorough search because they took the bath panel off.
Yeah.
And when they did that, they found a kit which seems like a murder kit.
The detective actually described it as what he thought was a murder bag.
Yeah.
Like, how chilling is that it's in your bathroom?
And it's in your own house. But that, again, had, like, rope, tape, surgical masks.
Tarpaulin, is that what you call it?
Tarpaulin. Yeah. Just a whole range of things that you would have no reason to be keeping, A, hidden, B, in your house.
And not all together.
C, all together, no.
Yeah.
So, just horrific. So, thankfully, Sweeney was then arrested and held for a week. But he was then released, again, under the agreement that he would return to his parents' house.
If you're watching Liverpool. On the video, you'll see so many eye rolls on this from me. Yeah. I'm just like, for God's sake. Because he's just been released too many times. Like, he's got previous for this. Like, why would he be released on bail for such a violent...
I know. And especially for an offender like this, who's got, like, prior for basically stalking.
Yeah.
Do you really think he's going to leave London and travel up to Liverpool on his own
and leave her
accord?
alone when he's got form for stalking?
No,
yeah,
absolutely not.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, this was exactly what happened, because rather than return to his parents' house, he decided to stake out Delia's home.
Yeah, she had, I think she had a bike, didn't she? Was it a push bike that she had? And I'm guessing she used to bring it in or out of the house. Maybe at night she'd go and bring it inside.
Yeah.
And she went out of the house to go to, like, down the few, like, little steps to go and get the bike. And what she did is she'd put a brick in the door to keep the front door open. Yeah. So I'm guessing if you haven't got your keys and the door shuts, you can't get back in again.
Yeah.
So she put like a brick there to wedge it open. And she said she was paranoid at this point anyway. Mm-hmm. And as she was, sort of looking over her shoulder, as she turned to one side, Sweeney is there in front of her. How scary.
Horrific. And he then attacked her again. with weapons. So he attacked her instantly, swinging an axe at her, but then also was armed with a knife. So he actually stabbed her in the chest, went through her breast, then her lung, and actually punctured her lung. Then stabbed her thigh. So she'd got multiple stab wounds. And then he'd actually swung at her, and she'd obviously put her hands up to defend herself and lost a finger. And she actually said that she saw her finger.
It was severed, wasn't it?
Yeah, and so that was just horrific. Ultimately, thankfully, it was a neighbour that saved Delia's life, because the neighbour heard what was going on. And again, I think she tried to use the bike at some stage to stop the weapons.
She put it over the top of her, I think, to try and sort of fend him off, yeah.
And I think the sound of the metal on metal is what the neighbours heard. Very bravely, they came out to try and stop the attack, and they'd actually got a baseball bat. So they hit Sweeney with the baseball bat, and this then stopped him. The police were called, and then Delia was taken to the hospital. At that stage, she needed 19 units of blood. She'd got 2 broken arms, she'd got a punctured lung, and she'd got these stab wounds.
Wow.
And obviously the injury to her finger. Sweeney then fled.
Yeah. He just went on the run, didn't he? He disappeared.
Yeah. So it's absolutely abhorrent. Like, you can't even imagine how frightened she would have been. As you say, just as you think you're kind of getting to a safer space.
Yeah.
Then the worst attack that's happened yet.
She'd actually gone to a women's refuge as well at one of the times, gone to a women's refuge. She'd spoke to the police, and she'd actually told the police that Sweeney had admitted to murdering Melissa.
Murder, yeah.
But it was as if like it was, I don't even know if it was recorded, but she said she felt like it was brushed off.
Yeah.
I think
they obviously knew that he was violent, but I think they thought that Sweeney was just trying to control her and trying to scare her.
Yeah.
And probably didn't take it seriously. Again, because this was a crime that had taken place in a different country, they probably didn't have the knowledge that it was true. You know, maybe if it had happened in Liverpool,
they'd have known about it.
They would have known that it was true and then looked into it. But I think because it was abroad, they probably just thought it was hearsay.
Yeah.
And again, the addition of saying that he'd also killed 2 German men, that does make it sound a little bit more.
Said he caught her in a hotel room with
story.
2 men and killed all 3 of them. So it is more far-fetched, because how are you fighting off 3 people?
Yeah.
Killing them all, and then managing to dispose of the bodies.
And then
without
again,
anyone knowing.
he'd said that he'd just sat in the room with them for days and not knowing what to do. Like, it does sound a lot more like someone that wants to be self-serving and
it's like something out of a film, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But ultimately, Sweeney did manage to evade capture, and he would then be on the run for another 6 years. But during that time, he was taunting the police. And again, we see this in really serious cases. Quite often, the offender will taunt the police. And in this case, he actually referenced the attack on Delia and said that it was an accident. So he'd actually spelled axe as in the weapon.
AXE, and then ident.
Yeah. And you just think, like, he's not even then concerned with just starting afresh and, you know, hiding from the police. He's actually just taunting them and still keeping a relationship with them. And it just all seems very...
Very odd.
Yeah.
So in 2008, there was a random call to the Met Police, and it was the SIO was called Steve Smith, and the Dutch police wanted to talk to them about an unidentified body in 1990.
Yeah.
So back then, obviously, we know that the DNA had not fully advanced, and because of the advances, they obtained a DNA profile. The body had been identified as Melissa
during... in 2007, wasn't it?
During a cold case review.
Yeah.
So like we said about everything having to be packaged correctly and ready to be used later on, this is a really good example of that. Sweeney had also confessed to Delia that he'd killed Melissa.
Yeah.
So the police at this point actually had to join forces with the Dutch police.
And it was the first international, I keep saying international, European murder inquiry between those two countries. So a pretty big deal. But again, quite a lot of instances that would connect John from the off if they looked at the records. Because obviously you've got multiple domestic violence offences in the UK, but then you've also got that one attack that happened over in Amsterdam against Melissa.
Yeah, and the common thing that linked all these victims was John Sweeney, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And the police, when they were looking into John Sweeney in general, they found a lot of his artwork.
Yeah, they'd actually searched a property that he was living at. I don't know whether it was Delia's.
I'm not sure if it was Delia's. I think it was somewhere where he was known to be staying. And they got all the artwork out, and we've said that it was dark artwork. But there was one, what was the name of the painting now? He'd actually named the painting something like A Romantic Weekend.
In Rotterdam.
No, in Austria.
In Austria, yeah.
And it was pictures of sort of someone holding up a knife, like grabbing someone by the throat.
So now, I hate to say it, but they are quite good artistically.
Yeah,
like
he was good at drawing. Yeah.
So it was like a silhouette, like a white silhouette of a male figure and then a female figure, but it looks like she has been decapitated.
Yeah.
There was another one which was a lot more sketch based, but that effectively showed someone being scalped almost. It looked like he'd scalped a victim.
Yeah, it was a blonde lady, and they believed that related to one of the victims as well. The lady who survived, Delia. Yeah, they thought that's what he was planning to do to her.
But it had something like over 100 sketches and pieces of artwork, but that all had this dark depravity to them. There was no, just sketches of girlfriends or anything like that. They all had this very...
They were all horrific.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, because I wonder whether it started out where it was just a curiosity in terms of the dark underworld kind of thing. Then he starts drawing possible fantasies or
and then
things,
moves to reality.
And then he wants to move to reality to test it. Maybe then So I just wonder whether the artwork came secondary and the violence was his inspiration for the artwork.
Or the other way.
Or whether it had been the other way.
I don't know.
Yeah.
In one of the pieces of artwork, he'd actually got an RIP message to Melissa, and it was on like a tombstone, and he'd sort of covered it up within the artwork, but forensics looked into it and like uncovered what was underneath the artwork as well, and it was sort of layered up. And because of the extreme nature of this artwork and what it portrayed, the police actually believed from the art that there is probably more victims, because there was a lot more in there. There was also like sketches of a woman in like the fetal position with no head, no feet, no hands. So his drawings were almost a confession. And they were actually used as a confession. On April the 4th, 2011, he was found guilty of 2 counts of murder, and he received a full life term in prison. He will never be released. So absolutely horrific what he put all those women through. And there's a lot of women. And if these are the ones we know about, there is ones that we don't know about as well.
Yeah. And to just think that he does have children out there as well, like how they deal with knowing who their father is.
Hopefully the mom will have like sort of shielded them from the main bits. But it depends how old they are, because you could just Google your dad's name, couldn't you?
Yeah.
And this would come up.
Yeah. So it is just horrific, and I think it does go to show the level of escalation, and just how tactical, because I do think that he must have had a knowledge of like crossing those state lines between Amsterdam and Rotterdam. trying to get away with it.
It was very calculated.
Yeah.
I think it was maybe he didn't know the exact time that he was going to do it, but remember back to when he was hiding in the wardrobe with his first wife, Anne, that's calculated. He's gone there with the weapon, stood in the wardrobe, waited for her to come out. Yeah. Like, it's all very timed and calculated.
There's again, isn't there? There's like, going in domestic violence situations, sometimes we see people that fly into a fit of rage due to you not having put the dishwashing away or whatever, and that's what sparks the anger. But in a lot of his cases, for example, he'd have been boiling on the fact that she was out with her friends for lunch and then decided that what he was going to do was tie her to the bed and then hold her hostage. That was premeditated. The offence on his first wife, where he hid with weapons, premeditated. We don't really know what happened with Melissa, but we do know that after the fact, again, very calculated. So I don't think that if they hadn't have caught him, he would have stopped.
No, I don't think. I think he would have just moved on to someone else. So we've got Delia and Anne, who survived his attacks, and then we've got Melissa and Paula, which unfortunately lost their lives at the hands of John Sweeney.
So we really hope that you've been able to follow that case. Obviously, it went cross-country, timeline. We tried to keep as chronological as possible. Hopefully you have enjoyed or found this case interesting. As I say, we've got a couple of cases coming up that have been recommended. We might have time for another one if someone gets in there quick before we finish for the season.
Finish for Christmas.
Oh, yeah. But apart from that, thank you ever so much for sticking with us. Thank you for listening to our 30th episode, and take care.
Bye.